And this really is also the context of the Anahita Speaker Series. In this series, we have the privilege of hosting a woman leader who has excelled in her field to share her professional and personal journey. And what makes it even more special is that she is in conversation with a younger woman at the threshold of her career. So with this, I now hand over to Pushkar Sarkar to introduce the Vedica Scholars Program, our speaker for today and the run-off event.
Thank you so much, Anu. Wonderful to have all of you here. We're blessed to have the excellent Ajantha Subramanian, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But let me tell you guys a little bit about Vedica. So the Vedica Scholars Program is an 18-month full-time residential program with a reimagined pluridisciplinary curriculum that has been carefully crafted to the expectations of employers today. So our mission is to prepare women with potential to achieve fulfilling careers and create a cadre of successful women professionals for the 21st century who can crack the proverbial glass ceiling. We at Vedica, we recognize and leverage the importance of diversity, and we leverage it for a better world and a better society. And we remain committed to women reaching their full professional potential. So as I said, we are absolutely blessed to have Dr. Ajantha Subramanian here with us today to speak to us and to speak to Ananya. She is a professor of anthropology and South Asian studies at Harvard University. Her first book, Shorelines, Space and Rights in South India, chronicles the struggles for resource rights by Catholic fishers on India's southwestern coast, with a focus on how they have used spatial imaginaries and practices to constitute themselves as political subjects. Her second book, The Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India, analyzes meritocracy as a terrain of caste struggle in India and its implications for democratic transformation. So over to Ananya, who will be the moderator for the talk today.
Thank you, Pushkar. Thank you, Anu. Very warm welcome to everyone joining us. Thank you for taking the time. Just as a quick clarification, we're looking forward to your questions. So if you're on Zoom, you can put your questions in the Q&A box or in the comment section on YouTube. We'll be monitoring them throughout the conversation, so please feel free to ask your questions. We're looking forward to them. I know that work from home has given us a lot of pain this year, but it has also allowed me and a lot of people to have a lot of conversations across continents. And I'm glad to be doing another one with Dr. Subramanian, who's currently at Harvard. I think the first question I'd like to ask, which I think would really benefit the audience here, is we really want to know what it was that sparked your interest in the area of caste, labor, and migration. We're particularly interested in knowing if there was a turning point, a learning point, and what are the foundational authors, activists, movements, or historical moments that have really inspired your research interests? And how have you been able to develop and nurture them over time?
Great. So thanks so much for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to be in conversation with all of you. So in terms of my areas of study, I'm sort of broadly interested in how histories of social stratification shape the political life of democracies, right? So, when it comes to India, any analysis of inequality and democracy has to address caste. Caste is a key structuring principle of Indian society. But I should also say that I've never thought of India in isolation. So, across all of my academic work, I've approached India as a site that is connected, and it's connected to wider networks of governance, of capital accumulation, of labor, and of political mobilization. And this kind of preference for a comparative and connective approach to India, I was thinking about it. It dates all the way back to at least my undergraduate days, when I studied religion. So my undergraduate major in college was religion. And I wrote my senior BA thesis on a comparative study of Dalit and African-American liberation theology. And so, you know, this impulse to think comparatively and connectively about India was sort of reinforced when I went to graduate school in anthropology, where I sort of developed a historically informed approach to questions of caste and labor and politics. So really thinking about India in historical perspective, you know, how did British imperialism shape the subcontinent? And, you know, what are the legacies that are still with us today from that period? But I think that my sense of India as a connected place also has to do with my personal history. So when I was a child, at the age of 6, my family moved to the Philippines because my father got a job with the Asian Development Bank. And we would come back to India every 2 years. And this going back and forth has always made me think of India as a place in relation to other places. And to think of how these sort of circuits of migration are critical in shaping both individual identity and collective identity, and also in shaping professional trajectories. So that's a little bit about my own kind of intellectual formation. In terms of authors, I would say the most important authors for me have been Karl Marx, Antonio Gramsci, the British cultural theorist Stuart Hall, and the Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Trio. And the reason I'm drawn to these authors is because they help me think about how and why inequalities persist, how they're justified culturally, right? So sort of what are the cultural idioms and practices through which inequalities are justified and maintained, and also what it takes to challenge them, right? So what it takes to actually transform society. I've also begun reading more Ambedkar, but Ambedkar is actually quite new for me. It's incredibly exciting to read his work, but this is a sort of this is a new foray for me. I mean, in terms of movements, I think my scholarship has always been informed by social movements. My first book was developed in solidarity with a social movement. This was the movement for artisanal fisher rights in India, you know, which intersected with transnational mobilization against capitalist globalization. The second book has been inspired by lower caste and anti-caste struggles, and also by the sort of solidarities between Dalit and Black movements. So yeah, I don't know whether you want to follow up on any of that, but let me just stop.
Sure. I mean, I'll pick something up from that. I think that you've clearly talked about caste as a structuring or organizing principle in India.
Right.
As caste is kind of largely absent from an American understanding of identity formation and from within, like in American academia, have you faced any kind of resistance within your field or your institution as you've developed your own research? Mm-hmm. And I'm especially interested in what your response is to the challenge you've faced in the form of a largely Western audience trying to understand caste as an organizing principle, or the Indian upper caste that talks about having transcended caste.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting, question. So I would say that it's been helpful to be an anthropologist in this regard. You know, one of the things that, you know, defines anthropology as a discipline is that we try to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange, right? So this is sort of one of the founding kind of tenets of the discipline. And I suppose I have used this method disciplinary method to try to convey the complexity of caste as a social formation, as a political formation to a Western audience. And I think it's particularly challenging to do this because most people who don't have any sort of direct knowledge of caste assume that it is utterly unfamiliar and that it's even inexplicable, right? Like it's so complex that there's no way to get your head around it. And so, you know, what I do is try to use comparison, right? To use parallels, I suppose, to try to make caste more familiar. So for instance, you know, the comparison between caste and racial stratification of the labor market, right? Which, you know, people in Euro-America are more accustomed to thinking about racial stratification, right? So that's a kind of interesting parallel through which they can understand caste as a political economic formation, right? Another instance is sort of hate crimes against interracial or intercaste marriages, right? I mean, this is another sort of point of comparison, which makes caste legible to people in the West. Another might be the kind of white and upper caste pushback against affirmative action. And then there's also the kind of liberal claim, right? And this is a claim on the part of both liberal whites and liberal upper castes, you know, the claim that they have transcended race and caste, right? That they have, in effect, become race blind or caste blind, which sort of disregards the way that elites of all kinds continue to be structurally advantaged, right, by their identities. So these are some of the ways that I think I try to convey the complexity of caste, you know, by saying it's not as unfamiliar as you assume it is, right? There are lots of kind of structural parallels that you can think about caste through, right? And understand its workings. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I would like to kind of focus on the part of your question about comparing systems of oppression, right? So there's been a lot of movements and attempts at comparison of race and caste, especially in trying to make it legible or understandable to a largely Western audience. I'm wondering if that has any drawbacks at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, these are not, there are differences, obviously, right, between the two. It's important to attend to both similarities and, you know, the point at which comparison reaches its limits, right? So, you know, I think part of what that means is thinking in terms of historical specificity, right? So how has caste been formed historically? But again, you know, caste is not some sort of autonomous formation, right? I mean, as I said, you know, part of my own work has been to think about the impact of British colonialism on caste formation. And obviously, you know, British colonialism is not a purely subcontinental phenomenon, right? So how then do we think about caste itself as a sort of transnational formation, right? So so when I say comparison, it's, you know, the other side of this kind of analytical strategy is connection, right? It's not just comparison, it's also connection. So it's not saying, you know, here are two completely disconnected societies and how do we sort of think of them in parallel? It's also, well, what are the kind of historical forces that have connected places like India to, say, the United States or to Fiji or to Jamaica, or, you know, so if you think about something like labor migration, this is not just a comparative analysis. This is about how, the mobility of peoples and ideas has been a kind of connecting thread between South Asia and other places, right? And how has that then shaped what we think of as a purely South Asian phenomenon, right? So I would say you can't engage in comparison alone. You've got to think about comparison alongside connection, right?
So in your book, The Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India, which released in 2019, you've talked about the myth making around meritocracy and its role in higher education in India. And also how Indians in the diaspora have arrived in other places like the United States with sort of their caste in their bags. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your key findings regarding meritocracy, especially in elite institutions like IITs and IIMs, and the mechanisms by which Indian upper caste domination is maintained in these quote unquote meritocratic institutions.
Yeah. So the book. So what does the book do? So the book narrates the process by which castes who historically have enjoyed certain privileges, right? Sort of privileged access to land, to labor, to education, to professional employment, how these groups were able to transform these inheritances into a claim to merit, right? So how does that happen? How does privilege become merit? And there are many mechanisms through which such groups were able to refashion themselves as modern meritocratic subjects. But I look at the role of engineering education in particular, right? And especially at the IITs, their role in mediating this process, right? And so part of the story is about the ideology of technical science, right? As a kind of objective, politically neutral form of knowledge, in which social identities seem to play no part, right? And so what I do in the book is show how in the Indian context, this ideology of objectivity and of sort of social disembeddedness, right? That this actually obscures the role of social stratification and caste distinction, right? In shaping access to the structuring of and the experience of engineering education, right? And I also look at the significance of three phenomena. So one is reservations. A second is the mass examination, right? And the third is transnational mobility. I look at these three phenomena and how these three phenomena have each contributed to kind of reinforcing this association between being upper caste and having merit, right? So this is the kind of the broad brush takeaway of the book, right? I mean, this is the way the book is structured. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I think we'd like to connect some of the conversation that we're having today about your book and your research with sort of more recent things that have been happening.
Yeah.
So there's a recent survey by Equality Labs of South Asian Americans that found that 2 out of 3 adult respondents had been treated unfairly at work, and 1 out of 3 had been treated unfairly at educational institutions. The recent Cisco lawsuit in California has revealed an endurance of caste-based discrimination in the United States in the tech sector. So I'm wondering how caste operates in the framework of American society, where it is generally absent from people's understandings of their own identity.
Yeah. So I think it's first important to understand the makeup of the U.S. Indian diaspora, right? So migration from India to the U.S. began pretty early. It began in the 1880s. But the floodgates really opened after 1965, right, with the US Immigration Act of 1965, which specifically targeted professionals, right? So as a result of this, the Indian American population now makes up the most affluent and the most well-educated node of the Indian diaspora, right? So compared to any other node of the diaspora, this is the most well-educated and the most affluent. And so, you know, some have referred to Indian Americans as the other 1%, right? And this is also an overwhelmingly, this is not a disconnected fact, this is also an overwhelmingly upper caste population. So in effect, what this shows us is that caste operates as a filter, right? So, you know, first it's a filter of which groups have access to education. Second, it's a filter of who can access elite higher education. And then third, it's a filter of who can use higher education as a kind of stepping stone to the US, right? So, so this kind of so the caste stratification of Indian society has meant that the most well-regarded and competitive institutions of higher education in India, like the IITs, continue to be spaces of caste privilege and pathways to diasporic mobility and success, right? And of course, you know, there's been a shift in the social composition of these institutions because of reservations, but these shifts have not yet made a noticeable impact on the most elite institutions and on patterns of transnational migration, right? So, and then the other thing to say is that the kind of capital that these mobile upper castes have, which is academic and professional credentials, this is the kind of capital that can be easily carried, right? So it's not like land, right? So it can be easily carried. And it's a transferable form of capital that has allowed for the further accumulation of capital, right? So you see this really clearly in the case of the IITs. So, you know, IIT alumni who typically come from histories of education and employment, what you might want to gloss as a form of caste capital, right? They've been able to use this caste capital to come to the US and accumulate even more capital in the US, you know, academic and technology sectors, right? So how did they position themselves in the US? Like, how do they think of themselves, right? So as members of a professional class, sort of upper caste Indian Americans have both been identified as and have identified themselves as members of a model minority, right? A model minority that is distinct from other kind of less successful non-white populations, right? And I think that the invisibility of caste, you know, the fact that caste is not really legible to most Americans, I think this invisibility of caste in the US has actually helped to reinforce this sort of assumption that upper caste achievements are just a form of self-made success, that they have nothing to do with structural advantages, right? And the Cisco case is interesting because, I mean, what it shows is that even though caste is not a public identity, right, in the US, it doesn't mean that it's not absent, right? And we see it in the case of IIT alumni networks that have kind of facilitated all kinds of opportunities in academia and industry, even as caste disappears from view, right? So caste works structurally, but it's not legible in the same way as, say, race is, right, in the US. And I think, you know, what the Cisco case shows is that these networks, these kind of professional networks that stretch back to India, right, and back to particular institutions of India, have sort of ensured that only certain people benefit from their pedigrees, right? So even when lower castes manage to get an IIT degree, right, what the Cisco case shows is that they are singled out, stigmatized, and excluded, right? So at Cisco, the Dalit engineer who's the kind of subject of the case, of the court case, his former classmates from IIT Bombay, what did they do? They outed him, right? They outed him as a reserved category student, which is a way of saying that, he had gained admission to the IITs illegitimately, that he was intellectually inferior, he was unworthy of a job at Cisco, and that he needed to be put in his place, right? So, and I think that they were able to act with a kind of sense of impunity precisely because caste is not recognized as a basis of either advantage or disadvantage in the US, right? And the Cisco case is potentially path-breaking because it exposes the workings of caste in the US, and it might actually result in the legal recognition of caste discrimination, right? So at the moment in the US, the only institution that has added caste to its non-discrimination policy is Brandeis University, right? So what the Cisco case could do is it has the potential to force the technology and academic sectors to recognize and prevent caste-based discrimination. And it might also empower lower caste students and employees to more openly address their own experiences of discrimination, right? I mean, we've seen from the Cisco case, there's been this sort of outpouring of testimonies on the part of sort of Dalit and other lower caste employees in the technology sector. But most of these testimonies have been anonymous because they're terrified of retaliation, right? So there's a real fear of exposure. I think the other thing that the Cisco case could do is it could encourage upper caste Indian Americans to become more aware of how their own caste backgrounds have afforded them unique opportunities. So, Ananya, I don't know if you were born in the US, but I think, most US born Indians are fairly ignorant of caste privilege. They tend to think of India simply as a place of economic constraint that their parents or their grandparents had to escape in order to find real opportunity, right, in the United States. And this kind of blindness to caste and to caste privilege, is really reinforced by the rags to riches story, right, of, Indian American success, which again is used against other minorities who are blamed for lacking the same accomplishments, right? So I think awareness of how their own families, caste backgrounds facilitated migration and professional success in the US will hopefully make US-born Indians kind of challenge these narratives, right, of their own exceptionalism, and really think about the intersection of caste, race, and class, right, in more critical ways. Yeah.
That was great. That actually answered a lot of questions I had from you. I think this is perhaps because I have an inherent sort of bias in understanding of engineering education and tech sector as male dominated.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that actually leads to making the role of upper caste women in upholding caste structures in sort of caste-based discrimination in workplaces and educational systems, but also in their communities. Do you think it's becoming invisibilized if we talk of caste specifically only in sort of these male-dominated places?
Okay, so let me just say one thing first before sort of directly answering the question. So when I did my research in the and most of it was at IIT Madras, right? Which even compared to other engineering institutions, sort of so-called second-tier institutions, the IITs are are much more male, right? Like the sort of percentage of women at the undergraduate level, I don't think has ever exceeded 10% at any of the IITs. So they're overwhelmingly male institutions, right? A little less so at the master's and PhD levels, but certainly when it comes to the BTech degree. So, but what I found when I was doing my research is that, upper caste women students largely shared the same prejudices about lower caste intellectual inferiority as their male counterparts, right? And their male counterparts. So when I would ask, for instance, why is it that there are so few women at the IITs? They would point to structural constraints, right? Societal biases, right? That prevented, say, families from allowing their girls to, go into engineering or some such thing, right? So the argument was never about women's inherent inability to compete, right? And this was in marked contrast to the way they saw lower caste students, right? Who were seen as, whose lower numbers at the IIT were seen as a byproduct of their inability to compete intellectually, right? So there was this really sort of marked contrast between the way gender and caste were addressed in relation to merit, right? So yes, I mean, I do think that often, women are let off the hook, right? I don't think, that somehow the kind of reproduction of caste and the maintenance of caste hierarchies is more attributable to men than to women. I mean, clearly, the caste order does disadvantage women in specific ways, right? So, women are subject to certain kinds of norms, right? Norms of behavior. They're expected to, more so than men, women are often expected to uphold certain forms of so-called tradition, right? So, this is not to say that caste doesn't sort of burden women in unique ways, but that doesn't mean that women are not also sort of complicit in sort of reinforcing systems of caste and helping to reproduce them. I think they absolutely are. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought that was great. I think we're going to start taking audience questions now.
Okay.
So just repeating to the audience that if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box on Zoom or in comments over YouTube. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So the first question here is from Manaswita Warma, and her question is, do you think there are alternative situations to the solutions to the problem of structural privilege other than reservations in academic institutions?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think reservations are a solution to structural inequality or more specifically poverty. I mean, I don't think making institutions of especially higher education more representative is a real corrective to, or is an adequate corrective, right, to the sort of far-reaching problem of structural inequality. I mean, for one, I think we really need to check the rampant privatization of education, right? So I think one solution would be to make education free and public, and to sort of reverse the course that India is on, which is sort of greater and greater privatization of sectors of the economy, which should be part of the kind of natural rights of citizenship, right? Whether it's education or health. So I think that that's one way to address structural inequality. I mean, India's not, and this is not just limited to India. There's, the sort of the question of wealth redistribution has never been adequately addressed, right? So from land reform on, what we're seeing is actually the exacerbation of inequalities, right? Of economic inequalities from the 1990s on, at least. So the idea that somehow greater privatization, greater sort of capitalist transformation will solve the question of inequality is absurd. And what we're seeing is exactly the opposite, right? So I think that affirmative action or reservations are necessary, but insufficient, because it's only a tiny fraction of the population that can even aspire to higher education, right? And the reason for that is because most people don't even have the means, right, to reach beyond a sort of a basic level of education. So I think that there needs to be a kind of wholesale structural transformation of the education sector. Education actually needs to be a right of citizenship, so that you really do have a much more sort of far-reaching redistribution of educational capital, right, and educational opportunities. But again, education is not the only site at which structural inequality needs to be addressed. So, the agrarian sector, for instance, has been completely sort of ignored and sort of superseded by a sort of overriding focus on something like IT. So there needs to be a sort of a kind of wholesale rethinking of how to address the problem of structural inequality. And reservations are such a kind of hot button issue. So much of the attention is kind of focused on the reservations question. So it's kind of, in some ways, I feel like it has, it's sort of drowned out a lot of other conversations that need to happen. But which have been raised by a number of people. So yeah, I mean, I don't think reservations are the only solution. I also don't think, but I also don't think that, I don't want this to be understood as a critique of reservation. As I said, I think reservations are necessary but insufficient. Yeah.
There's also a question that we've addressed certain parts of. So it's, what is your estimation of Indian students in the US views on caste and caste discrimination? Do you see any difference between students who've recently moved to the US and students who are second or third, or people who are second or third generation, I guess? But I think what I would add here is sort of, is there a difference between the wave of immigration that happened in the 80s, 90s, and the wave of immigration that sort of post-liberalized India? Is there a difference of views there?
Yeah, I mean, I can't, I mean, what I'm going to say is much more, it's not based on my own kind of analytical study, right? This comes more out of sort of lay observations, right? I would say that, that students who were born in the US and raised in the US, and who have experienced certain forms of racialization, right, as minorities, I think that there's more of a potential there for forms of solidarity, right, with other kind of non-white populations. But it's not necessarily the case that that happens, right? So there's more of a possibility of that, I think. I mean, we're seeing now, I think, when I see students, my undergraduates these days, in some ways, I think that they're the most radical crop I've ever taught, right? And this includes Indian American undergraduates. They are much more kind of open to a sort of radical questioning of race and capitalism. They're really sort of they're mobilized in a way that I don't think previous generations were. And perhaps this has to do less with a kind of, I'm not sure if this is a distinction between kind of US born and Indian migrant students. But I do think that there is a kind of growing just disaffection with liberal democracy and its limits, right? And the kind of unthinking acceptance of a kind of capitalist economic order, right? I mean, students are heavily in debt. They see the kind of horizon closing in on them. There's a real sense of a lack of opportunity. And think of the moment that we're in, right? I mean, we're facing a pandemic of kind of historical proportions. We're seeing sort of massive job losses and a kind of shutting down of the economy. Police shootings. I mean, the undergraduates that I have in my classes, when they were in school, I'm sure this is the case for you too, Ananya, right? Like you go through these routine active shooter drills. I mean, they feel like they're growing up in a dystopic society, right? And that has had a kind of political effect on them. So I'm mostly speaking about US-born Indians, right? People who have grown up here and who really don't have a kind of idealistic view of either of the US and of kind of capitalist society in general. Now, as for the migrant students from India, I don't think that this applies equally to them, right? I do think that there's a kind of, I don't know, I'm not exactly sure how to put it, but, there's a kind of embrace of sort of neoliberalism, right? And a sense of kind of having arrived, right, on the global stage. They're beneficiaries of, Modi's India, and I sense that there's a less kind of critical stance on either kind of neoliberal capitalism or authoritarianism. But these are gross generalizations, right? So it's not that there aren't students in both groups that hold kind of counter positions, right? But I do think that there's something about the US feeling like a kind of fading empire, right? That the glory days of the United States are behind us, and we're heading into a bleak future. It's a bleak present and it's a bleak future. And I think students are reflecting that in their views. And I think Indian students, especially privileged Indian students, don't feel the same way. They feel like the future is theirs, and they're told that. So I do think there's a difference in the stances that they're taking on a whole range of issues.
The next question's from Malika Anand over Zoom. And she is asking about keeping in light the specific caste history of the Madras presidency and Tamil Nadu. How do you think the relationship between engineering education and caste is different in other parts of the country?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, I'm an anthropologist, so I tend to do sort of site-specific work. So, even though I spoke at the beginning about the importance of comparison, most of us don't do the kind of comparative work that, say, a political scientist would do, right? I mean, we do sort of immersive research in individual sites, but we think of those individual sites in relation to other sites, right? I mean, absolutely. I think that one has to understand the operations of any of the IITs in relation to their regional context, right? So how has, every region has a very sort of specific caste history, right? So how has the caste history of, say, the Bombay presidency shaped the social makeup and the kind of cultural attitudes, right? The sort of dominant cultural attitudes in IIT Bombay. And one can ask a similar set of questions for any of the IITs, right? So even though the IITs are national institutions, they are profoundly shaped by their regional context. So I think I'm hoping that, that my book sparks more studies on other IITs where people are really probing the relationship between national institutions and regional histories of caste, right? And how these play out differently, right, in different contexts. So, just as one example, a lot of the kind of upper caste students at IIT Bombay, even if they're, it isn't a predominantly Brahmin population, right? As it is in IIT Madras. So that itself makes a difference, right? There's a kind of ideology of intellectualism that really sort of dominates upper caste sensibilities in IIT Madras, which is less the case in IIT Bombay, right? So there's a kind of notion of entrepreneurialism, which is more prevalent, which has to do with the relationship between IIT Bombay and the kind of upper caste populations of that region, right? So I think that one has to kind of think very, very kind of in a very site-specific ways, about these institutions.
Right. The next question is from YouTube, and it's about how do Indian Americans respond to their own racialization in America, where race is largely thought of in the binary of white and black politics?
Yeah. So yes, as I said, Indians are both the most affluent and educated racial minority in the US, and they are a racial minority, right? So they are subject to kind of American ideologies of race. And, as with all minorities, sort of Indian Americans have had to navigate the landscape of American racism, right? Where whiteness and blackness kind of signify sort of polar ends of a spectrum, right? So this question of where you fit on that spectrum is one that all groups in American society have to address, right? so I think that the kind of education, if you will, in American racism has taught Indian Americans kind of how to navigate the sort of promises and pitfalls of life in the US, right? So a common assumption has been that the sort of path to social status and to financial security requires avoiding the taint of Blackness, right? So, you know, in the early 20th century, the way that kind of more elite Indian migrants dealt with this was to claim that they were white, right? That as members of the Aryan race, they were de facto whites, right? And so this is the way they sort of tried to navigate American racism. In the post-65 period and sort of with the rise of American multiculturalism, this claim to whiteness is not as necessary. So now it's much more kind of class and nationality that have become sort of tools that are used by Indian Americans to distinguish themselves from other non-whites, right? And you know, the IT boom has been really important for sort of enhancing the status of Indians in the US because, you know, Indianness is increasingly associated with kind of technical knowledge, you know, and professional success. So that has been really sort of important in kind of situating Indians, again, as a model minority, as I said before, right? What else should I say about that? So I mean, they're interesting. So I can point to kind of particular kind of political phenomena that help to kind of illuminate Indian American attitudes towards race. So many of the people that I interviewed for the second book, you know, the same people who oppose reservations in India, a lot of them actually support affirmative action in the US, right? So how do you explain this kind of curious contradiction? And the way they explained it to me is that for them, affirmative action in the US is about multicultural diversity, which they see as legitimate, right? Whereas they see reservations as illegitimate because it's about it's about quotas. It's about quotas as a necessary corrective to historical inequalities, and they sort of reject this approach, right? The reason they accept affirmative action in the US is because they see it as a policy that is aimed at kind of selecting these exceptional individuals from underrepresented groups, right? And so this is sort of consistent with their ideas of meritocracy, their ideas of kind of liberal individualism. And so they're fine with it, right? I mean, it also does advantage Indian Americans because we're seen as diversifying institutions. Our presence as non-whites is seen as a kind of, is seen as a plus, right, to institutional diversity. So that gives you some sense of, I mean, I could go on and on, but maybe I should stop. I mean, there's all sorts of other things, like there's a controversy around California textbooks and the representation of Hinduism in these textbooks, and that brought out a whole other kind of set of tensions among Indian Americans. But let me just leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. I think this is going to be the last question we ask. We're running out of time. But it's related to what you've talked about, actually, where there's a lot of conversation in India, obviously, about the politics of caste, and especially how it shows up at electoral politics. Yeah. And as sort of majoritarian political movements are taking hold in both the United States and India, do you think that South Asians in the US are voting and engaging politically with caste in mind, whether they're engaging in India or in the United States?
So this actually is a way for me to talk about the California textbook controversy. So, yeah, so the Cisco case is not the first time that caste was publicly debated in the US, right? So the California textbook controversy of 2005, so the Vedic Foundation and the Hindu Education Foundation, these are two kind of groups, they complained that California Curriculum Commission had negatively portrayed Hinduism in sixth grade history textbooks. And so the main objections were that, you know, the mentions of caste and gender oppression were wounding to Hindu sentiments, right? And they framed this in terms of a denigration of religious minority sentiments, right? So in effect, what these organizations were trying to do was kind of characterize educational material about structural violence within Hinduism, right, as evidence of their own victimization by a non-Hindu majority. And these are also groups that are aligned with the Hindu right in India, right? I mean, these are groups that openly and actively support the BJP, support kind of Modi's brand of, you know, authoritarian populism and majoritarian nationalism. So, you know, we might expect that the experience of minoritization in the US would produce greater sympathy and solidarity with minorities in India, but in fact, often the opposite is the case, right? A sizable percentage of upper caste in the diaspora have become avid backers of the Hindu right. You know, and I see this as part of as yet another way of expressing forms of caste prejudice, of Islamophobia, that they have brought with them from India. But I think, like other long distance nationalisms, it also expresses the desire for a country of their own, where they are an unchallenged majority, right? And I think it's actually the distance from India that has reinforced this investment in majoritarian nationalism. Now, I mean, in the US, some of them are even supporters of Trump, right? Or were supporters of Trump. So, you know, in 2018, the Republican Hindu coalition sort of took out a march in support of Trump's efforts to build a wall on the US-Mexico border, right? And they sort of said, you know, this is, that they opposed kind of illegal immigration, right? And were in favor of legal immigration. So they were really sort of situating themselves as like proper migrants, right? And opposing the improper migrant. So you see that, you know, a lot of them are supporters of both majoritarianism at home, right? And in the homeland, right? So yeah.
I think that's it for the questions from the audience. I'm really sorry if your questions didn't get picked. We had quite a few of them. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for talking to us. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope our audience enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. It really was. You know how I haven't read your book, I confess, but you really hold up a mirror to this so-called notion of which all of us, you know, at some level are so proud of, the meritocracy of IITs and all of these institutions. You know, we always brag about it, especially to those who are not from this country. But yeah, there is so much more to it than just, you know, people rising to the top because of merit. There are so many advantages that one never thinks about. Yes, I do hope, like you said, that your books spark off more research. I think we all need to introspect on these very widely held notions a little bit more and not fling them around like this.
Yeah, well,
thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much. Thanks, Ananya. That was a really great set of questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Subramanian. Once again, we're absolutely blessed to have you. I'm so proud of our scholars, many of whose names I saw in the attendees. Thank you guys so much for coming out and taking this opportunity. It was great to see you guys interacting and engaging in the questions as well. So once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Subramanian. I'd like to thank Carnegie for helping us arrange this and everything and getting it set up. Looking forward to the next one.